When I graduated from medical school, I took an oath. I stood up, I raised my right hand, and I swore to prevent disease whenever I could. In my youthful innocence, I believed that the battles that lay ahead of me would be against cancer, heart disease, and emotional disorders. I'm no longer so naive. After 2.5 decades and thousands of hours with young people in distress, I've discovered that my most challenging fight is not against dangerous diseases, but against dangerous ideas. I am here today to discuss these dangerous ideas. Ideas such as children are sexual from the moment they are born. Exploring sexual relationships is healthy at every age. Young people should be encouraged to question the moral values they've learned at home. Individual rights take precedence over the rights of a population to be protected from disease. These ideas are, in fact, at the foundation of the so-called comprehensive sexuality education programs that have been created by International Planned Parenthood Federation and SIECUS. There are a number of publications that I'm referring to. One of them is called Healthy, Happy, and Hot. The other one is the International Guidelines for Sexuality Education, which were distributed by UNESCO. Now, you're not going to notice the dangerous ideas that I mentioned a minute ago. You won't necessarily notice them in these publications because they are written with positive language that will lead you to believe, yeah, this sounds good. This sounds like a message that I want for the youth of my country. Here's a copy of Healthy, Happy, and Hot. You can also find it online. But please, take a close look at these publications, and that's what we're going to be doing today. If you examine the material closely, in particular, material like this that's been written for youth, not the material that's written for policymakers and other adults, you will see that these programs are not what you think they are. For example, Healthy, Happy, and Hot is written for HIV-positive youth. In this publication, casual sexuality with multiple partners is celebrated. There is no encouragement to abstain from sex. There is no encouragement to limit partners. Quite the opposite. As a doctor caring for young people over the past 25 years, I've seen a steady stream of patients come through my office, mostly girls and young women. They have been suffering from the sexual decisions that they made, and their suffering was 100% avoidable. I saw so many casualties that I wrote a book about my patients. I called the book Unprotected. I told their stories, and I explained how radical ideas in my profession contributed to their situations. It's very frustrating as a doctor to see one person after another in your office, young people with their lives ahead of them, working hard to pursue their dreams, but having to deal with pain and suffering that could have been avoided had they been fully informed and made better decisions. It's because of the students that I met, whose stories I told in this book, that I'm here today. After this book, Unprotected, I began to study what's taught in sex education, especially what's on the websites and books recommended to adolescents. And I wrote my second book called You are teaching my child what? As a physician, I have one objective: to keep people out of the offices of doctors and therapists. I've discovered in my research that the vision of groups such as Planned Parenthood and SIECUS, that's the Sexuality, Information, and Education Council of the United States, the vision of these groups stand in my way because their priority is not sexual health. Their priority is sexual freedom. These large and powerful organizations believe that sexuality extends from cradle to grave. They endorse early sexual activity, multiple partners, and sexual experimentation. But these, of course, are the very behaviors that fuel the epidemics of sexually transmitted disease, HIV/AIDS, abortion, and emotional distress. Those who practice the lifestyles endorsed by these groups have more doctor's appointments, not less. And that's so for a very simple reason. When sexual freedom is the priority, when people are encouraged to begin sexual activity at an early age, to explore and to experiment with different partners, then sexual health suffers. Please keep in mind that these programs are described as comprehensive, accurate, and science-based. They claim to provide young people with all the information they need to make informed, responsible decisions. They imply that having all this information will lead to the healthiest decisions. But I've studied the Planned Parenthood and SIECUS curricula and websites, and the material that they create for children and adolescents. And I'm here to tell you that their sexuality education is none of those things. It is not comprehensive. It is not medically accurate. And it does not provide young people with all the information they need. I know that these are strong statements, but I promise you that they are made after extensive research and careful deliberation. One of the things you need to understand is that sexuality education is a social movement. Its goal is to change society. That was true 50 years ago when it began, and it's true now. The movement envisions a world without sexual taboos and restrictions, a world, you could say, free of Judeo-Christian morality. Each individual, regardless of age, makes his or her sexual choices. Each person decides how much risk he or she is willing to take, and no judging is allowed. In this ideal world, there is complete gender equality. Girls and boys, women and men, everyone faces the same risks from their sexual decisions. This idea permeates sexuality education, but there's a problem with it. The problem is it's not based in reality. When it comes to the negative consequences of sexual activity, and you know what they are: infection, cancer, infertility, unwanted pregnancy, there is no gender equality. There never was, and there never will be. It is primarily girls and women who suffer the consequences of early sexual activity and multiple partners. That's not sexist. That's biology. It's anatomy, physiology, and it has to do with organ structure, hormones, and brain function. It's biology that every girl must know. This hard science, and I'm going to tell you more about it in a few minutes, is omitted from sexuality education because, I believe, it challenges the dream of gender equality and freedom of sexual expression. So my argument today is that the sexuality education programs created by Planned Parenthood and SIECUS and distributed by UN agencies do not do what they claim to do. They do not protect the health and well-being of young people. Instead, they sexualize children and encourage behaviors that place their health and well-being at risk. What I'm going to do now first is explain to you the origins and the philosophy of what's called comprehensive sexual education. Then I'll tell you about the science that's omitted. I'll tell you what young people should be told, must be told, but are not. Then you will hear about what you can do to make it happen, to stop the sexualization of children, and to advocate for their health and innocence. Where did the radicalism of today's sex education come from? It began in the 60s. It used Alfred Kinsey's model of human sexuality as its foundation. We now know that Alfred Kinsey's research, upon which he based his crusade for social reform, was fraudulent, and that he was a deeply disturbed individual. In a nutshell, Kinsey was convinced that traditional morality is irrelevant and destructive. It was anything goes when it came to sexuality for this man, and I mean anything. He believed, for example, that pedophiles were misunderstood and their punishments unjust. Sexuality is not an appetite to be curbed, Kinsey insisted. He taught that and he lived it. I doubt very much that in all of Kinsey's 62 years of his miserable life, he knew even one day of what we in this room would consider healthy sexuality. Now here's what's so astonishing. This man's personal sexual philosophy has been institutionalized in modern sexuality education. Today's curricula are based on Kinsey's teachings. It's as if someone came along and says that when it comes to diet, we got it all wrong. And I have the research to prove it. My way is better. Eat lots of red meat, eats lots of oil and sugar and caffeine. I have the data to prove it. And people get very excited about it. They build a whole industry around it. And then years later, it's discovered that this person whose model of healthy nutrition that everyone has adopted actually had high blood pressure, diabetes, and heart disease. This is how upside down it is. Kinsey died in 1956, and a few years after that, SIECUS was founded. SIECUS, the Sexuality, Information, and Education Council of the U.S. And I'm going to just inject here that I understand that SIECUS has been nominated to be a consultative status to the United Nations. This is going to be probably rubber stamped, approved in June. We have to do everything we can to stop that. SIECUS is not an organization that you want having influence over your children and your countries. Now, when SIECUS was founded, I want you to understand that in the early 60s, thanks to antibiotics, the most common STDs, which were syphilis and gonorrhea, were being obliterated because we had these antibiotics. And everyone thought, this is great. We're not going to have any more STDs because we have these antibiotics. Can you imagine? But that was the thinking. And also in 1960, birth control pills became available. So these hazardous infections were thought to be cured, and pregnancy, it was assumed now, unwanted pregnancy is unavoidable. We have the pill, and we have antibiotics. So those problems, was the thinking at that time, are gone. They've been eliminated. The only obstacles now toward Kinsey's way of thinking about sexuality was middle-class morality. So SIECUS was founded by Dr. Mary Calderon, who came from Planned Parenthood. And like Kinsey, she believed that there was an urgent need to break from the traditional views about sexuality. She felt that sex education has too much negativity. Too much focus on disease and unwanted pregnancy. The real problem, she said, was that society is puritanical and repressed. There were too many no's in sex education, the founder of SIECUS stated. Her approach would be based on yeses. Proper sex education would teach children that from the day they're born they are sexual beings, and that the expression of their sexuality is positive, natural, and healthy. She wrote a book for parents, and she said, "Children are sexual and think sexual thoughts and do sexual things. Parents must accept and honor their child's erotic potential." Professionals who study children have recently affirmed the strong sexuality of the newborn. This was based on Kinsey's reports that he got from pedophiles who were molesting infants and children under the age of 1 and recording their results. In addition to teaching cradle-to-grave sexuality, the goal of sex education was not to force any particular standard on anyone, but to make information available to help young people reach their own decisions. So, for example, suggesting that waiting until adulthood or waiting till marriage is best, that wouldn't work. That wouldn't be allowed, because the purpose is not to force a particular standard. The point is just to make information available and then let young people reach their own decisions. And this is still very much the case in sexuality education today. A goal of sex education was to provide young people with an opportunity to question, explore, and assess their own and their community's attitudes about society, gender, and sexuality. Now that language sounds kind of good maybe, but you have to think about this. They're giving children, they're encouraging children to question what they've been taught. I'm not sure that all parents would want that. So what did it mean exactly when Dr. Calderon said that sex education has to be open and positive, to replace the no's with yeses? What did it mean to break from traditional views? It meant much more than premarital and extramarital sexuality. Modern sex education was about breaking boundaries. This is from the co-founder of SIECUS. He said, "Religious taboos are highly restrictive. Our whole belief system needed to be reconsidered. Traditional religion had failed because it walled people in and it prescribed boundaries for thinking. The boundaries of human sexuality," he said, "need to be expanded. And physical pleasure," he said, "has worth as a moral value." It went so far that the vice president of SIECUS in 1980 said, "It is time to admit that incest need not be a perversion or a symptom of mental illness. A childhood sexual experience, such as being the partner of a relative or an older person, need not necessarily affect the child adversely." That's from a SIECUS board member, as reported in Time magazine, 1980. Time magazine called these people the pro-incest lobby. All these ideas together that I've mentioned, that sexuality extends from cradle to grave, that young people have sexual rights, that adults should just stand to the side and allow them to make their own choices, that morality walls people in, and that taboos must be relaxed, these beliefs sexualize children. I want to point out to you that what these organizations present to parents and policymakers is different than what they actually end up teaching young people. For example, these groups claim that sexual behavior needs to be delayed. that high-risk behavior should be discouraged as much as possible. And ideally, there shouldn't be any sex until young people are in a serious, committed relationship. They say that in public forums and in material written for parents and policymakers. For example, there was an interview on the radio with the public policy director of SICUS, and he was asked, "You would agree that it would be best if kids didn't have sex in high school, am I right?" He said, "Listen, absolutely. It is better for young people to wait to have sex. There is no question about that." Well, that sounds reassuring, right? We'd all like that. But let's look at a pamphlet that comes out of SICUS, that comes out of this organization. It's called Talk About Sex. This is how it starts. Every human being has basic rights. Still, adults may say and do things that make young people feel like they don't have rights. It's important for you to know your rights so that you can stand up for yourself when necessary. At every point in your life, you can choose if and how to express your sexuality. Most sexual behaviors involve some level of risk. It is up to you to determine how much risk you are willing to take. This is from a book that was endorsed by Planned Parenthood. It's about uncertainty about making the decision of becoming sexually active. No one can tell you whether you're ready for sex. You're the only one who knows whether you can handle the responsibility. And there are many, many examples. I'm not going to go through all of them. But basically, you can see that this is not encouraging kids to wait. This is not doing what these organizations have promised to do. Furthermore, they actually introduce students to high-risk behaviors and lifestyles and normalize them and discuss them as acceptable, healthy options. This is about anal sex. This is on a website for young people. Some straight couples use anal sex as a way to preserve the woman's virginity. For those who like it, anal stimulation can be a part of masturbation, intercourse, or oral sex. Now, do we have any infectious disease experts in this room? We don't really need one. I'm sure that you understand that what's being proposed here, you'll have to pardon me, but oral fecal contact. This is probably one of the most highest risk behaviors one can imagine. Not something that parents necessarily want their kids to know about, let alone to practice. Now dentists have been advised to screen in the mouth for oral cancers. And those oral cancers are very often related to the human papillomavirus, which people are getting from having multiple oral sex partners. Another very important piece of information that's not being told to our children. So basically we're talking about important health information that is not included in comprehensive. It's called comprehensive, right? Comprehensive means that it includes everything that you want to know. Now here's a very important piece of information about the human papillomavirus causing cancer in the mouth that kids are not being told. Instead, Planned Parenthood is telling them about anal sex and oral anal contact. This is HPV's link to head and neck cancer investigated. This is from 2007. We've known about this for a long, long time. Why it's not in comprehensive sexuality education is anyone's guess. Okay, let's move on. This is the human papillomavirus. It is responsible for every case of cervical cancer. It has now been determined that in order to develop cervical cancer, the presence of this virus is necessary. Why are young women especially susceptible to the human papillomavirus? It's because of their cervix. Their cervix is immature. The cervix is the opening to the uterus. it's been visualized here in this picture, and on the right side is a diagram. On the left side of the diagram is what a mature cervix looks like. The covering is thick. It's covered with many layers of cells so that it's difficult to infect. But the immature cervix, the cervix of a teenager and a young adult, is only one cell thick. This area is called the transformation zone, the area that's only covered by one cell. And as a girl gets older, this zone shrinks. It's like a bullseye that's shrinking over time. When the bullseye is bigger, the human papillomavirus, chlamydia, and other STDs have this perfect area to infect. It's so easy. And when you think about it, also you think about the anatomy of a woman, of a girl, the ejaculate containing the STD is shooting right there, right on to that bullseye there. And this is why so many girls are infected with the human papillomavirus as well as other STDs. With age, that area, as I said, gets smaller, and then with childhood, it disappears completely. Everyone is different. People come up to me and say, how old do you have to be for this all to be done and for the transformation zone to be not present anymore? I don't know. Everyone is different, but if you go to the doctor and you have an internal exam, you can ask what the size is of your transformation zone. Here is a picture of the adult cervix. This pink area is the area of, it's many cells thick, it's nice and smooth. The immature cervix has this transformation zone in the middle, and that is the area that is only one cell thick. I call the transformation zone the cells that it's made out of, politically incorrect cells. Okay, I call them that because they go against the ideology that says girls and boys are the same. They indicate that girls do have an increased vulnerability when it comes to sexually transmitted diseases. Now, boys don't have an area of vulnerability like this in their reproductive system. But they do have an area just like this, as do girls, in their digestive system. So in the anal area, for example, the tissue there is very fragile and one layer thick, just like the transformation zone. Now, this is in Spanish. Feliz, fuerte y fabuloso. Did I say that? I know, but I wanted to say it in Spanish.
Just in case.
That's about all the Spanish I know. So in this pamphlet, Planned Parenthood had a terrific opportunity to explain this because they're talking to HIV-positive youth. Okay, many of those youth are going to be guys, and many of those guys are going to be participating in anal intercourse. This would have been the perfect time to say, look, that area is very vulnerable. It's easily torn. There's a lot of blood vessels there. It's easy to get infected, especially with HIV. Aside from through blood, through a transfusion, for example, HIV is most easily transmitted through anal intercourse. It is at least 20 to 30 times easier to transmit HIV through anal intercourse than through vaginal intercourse. This would have been a perfect opportunity to explain that to young people. Now this point about the cervix is well known in the medical community. This is from the CDC. Sexually transmitted diseases pose a severe threat to women's health and fertility. Biological factors place women at greater risk than men. One of those biological factors, there are others too, is the immature cervix. Now, this science about a girl's vulnerability is omitted from the comprehensive sexuality education. And they're the ones that claim to be feminists. They're the ones that say they want to advance the welfare of young women. This is totally upside down. The immature cervix should be at the front and center for anyone teaching sexuality education. Biology says wait. Biology says girls are more vulnerable than boys. And this offends certain groups, but it's the truth. Now I want to mention one more thing, and that's about, again, getting back to this pamphlet. In this pamphlet, young people who are HIV positive are told that they have the right to sexual pleasure, but they don't have the obligation to their partners or to society in general of disclosing their status before a sexual encounter. Let me explain that. They are telling HIV positive people that they do not need to share their status until they feel comfortable doing so, until the time is right for them. Now let's think about that for a minute. Let's just go through this. Say you have a young man who's HIV positive. Let's call him A. He gets together with another young man, let's call him B. They have sex. A, having read this pamphlet, has decided, I have no obligation to tell people whether I'm positive or not. B has not been able to make an informed decision about this sexual act. He wasn't aware of the risk. Then, when B turns positive, and there are people who after one sexual encounter become HIV positive, I have met them personally. So when person B becomes positive, his diagnosis and his treatment is delayed because he had no idea. That's dangerous to him. Now, that person B who's newly infected, his serum viral load is through the roof because that's the time in the initial infection, in the first period before, in fact, your HIV test is even positive, that your viral load goes through the roof. And so he's going around and he's having sex with other people. That's how an epidemic is born, and that's how a pandemic grows. And then we ask, why is AIDS out of control? The goals of comprehensive sexuality education, they say, is to reduce risky behaviors. And then they come out and tell this to people about not having to disclose their HIV status. Because of this, innocent people will lose their lives. I am certain that that will happen. Now, let's move on to another fascinating topic in science that is withheld from young people, and that is about what's called the biochemistry of attachment. We now know, in the past 20 years or so, we have the science that has indicated that hormones are released during intimate behavior that cause feelings of attachment and trust, especially in women, because oxytocin is primarily a female hormone. I call it, like those cells, a politically incorrect hormone, because again it challenges the agendas that say the differences between men and women are due to culture, are due to socialization. It challenges the idea that sexual behavior can be easily separated from emotional attachment. So what's a hormone? A hormone is a molecule that travels from one organ to another, and it has a message. Depending on the context, oxytocin carries different messages throughout the body. During labor, it travels from the brain to the uterus, and it says to the uterus, contract and expel the baby. During nursing, oxytocin travels from the brain to the breast saying, make milk available for the infant. Oxytocin also travels within the brain with messages about emotions and behavior. If you take a virgin rat and you inject her with oxytocin and then place her in a cage with another rat's litter, though that virgin rat that was injected with oxytocin will act as if those baby rats are her own. So oxytocin carries the message, create a bond, create an emotional connection. Now what young people need to know is that oxytocin is released during intimate behavior. Intercourse is not necessary for oxytocin to be released, and need I say that condoms have no effect on the actions of this hormone. Am I proposing that a casual sexual encounter causes a deep emotional bond, such as what you see between a mother and a child? Of course not. I am not doing that. That would be kind of ridiculous. What I'm suggesting, though, is that we can learn from our biology. We are wired not only to experience pleasure from moments of closeness and intimacy, we are wired as well to have an emotional and a cognitive reaction to the person that we're with. Another difference between male and female is that estrogen ramps up the actions of oxytocin, and testosterone, the male hormone, dampens it. And this is fascinating. When is estrogen highest? It's highest right before ovulation. That's when it peaks. So just listen to how we are made so beautifully. That at the moment during the month, at that time, that we can conceive and bring a new life into the world, we are most primed to emotionally attach to that person with whom we are creating that life. In addition to promoting attachment, oxytocin affects our judgment and our risk-taking. It affects the brain circuits related to feelings of trust. So basically, when young people are sexually active, especially a girl, oxytocin is affecting the center of her brain that should be waving red flags. Like, let's say it's just a casual encounter, a one-night stand, someone that she doesn't really know. Normally, her brain would be waving these red flags and saying, you better think about this. Is this safe? Is this good? How are you going to feel about this tomorrow morning? Is this smart? But oxytocin acts on that part of the brain, the amygdala, and it kind of quiets it down. So she's less cautious and less suspicious. Now again, under the right circumstances, in the relationship with the right guy, and you know he's going to be there, and you know he's good for you, and he knows all those good things, you want to have that happen. You don't want to be thinking, gee, he didn't do the laundry yesterday. I don't know. He's gained a lot of weight. He doesn't look good to me. You don't want all that happening. You want to connect with him. So oxytocin, depending on the circumstance, acts in healthy, wonderful ways. But young people need to know that it can also act in ways that can compromise their judgment. Now, young people come to me after having hooked up a few times, especially girls who have hooked up with a guy, and they say, "What's wrong with me, Dr. Grossman? I'm feeling attached to him. What's wrong with me?" Typically, she's yearning for some sign that he likes her too. She's checking her emails and she's waiting to get text messages from him. She wants a sign that there's a connection. I tell them, there is nothing wrong with you. They are relieved to discover they're not crazy. I explain about oxytocin and about bonding. The only thing that's wrong with these young people is that they are ignorant about this and other biochemical truths about sexuality. And about that, they don't have a clue. Why should they, though? All these comprehensive sexuality education programs don't tell them about this. So how are they supposed to know? I'll just mention there's fascinating research that's being done on oxytocin. For example, individuals with autism. Autism is a disorder of connection. People who have autism, they often prefer things rather than people. They don't connect well. They don't make eye contact frequently. They get very anxious. They have trouble trusting people, reading social cues. Well, oxytocin has been given to these people, and they've been found to improve in those areas. Another very fascinating study. 2 groups of women who had had babies 2 weeks earlier were compared. One group had gone through normal labor and delivery, and during normal labor and delivery, oxytocin just gets incredibly high, sky high. The other group had had a planned cesarean section. They didn't go through labor and delivery. They didn't have all that oxytocin. 2 weeks later, these moms were put in a room and their heads were placed in magnetic resonance imaging scans. Their brains were scanned to look at their reaction when their baby cried. The brains of the women who had gone through the normal labor and delivery and had had all that oxytocin, their brains were more sensitive than the other moms. I don't want anyone in this room who's had a cesarean section to feel like, oh my gosh, I missed out on that. There's some problem with my bonding with my child. Don't think that at all. This is just interesting research that is supporting the idea that oxytocin is involved with sensitivity that women have toward bonding. Oxytocin switches love and trust on, and it switches caution and aversion off in the brain. Now I'm going to just wrap it up, even though there's a lot more to say. I want to say that the stakes here are very, very high. The sex drive is, of course, wonderful, natural, and healthy. And teens need to be told that. But they also need to be told that although it's natural and wonderful and healthy, that acting on it in adolescence is not. Sex is a serious matter. One encounter can change your life forever. The female reproductive system especially is delicate and fine-tuned. It is not to be taken for granted. The programs that are created by Planned Parenthood and SICUS, that are exported around the world through the United Nations, are dangerous. Instead of providing this kind of material and a message that truly endorses and encourages a healthy ideal, the ideal of waiting till adulthood and hopefully until marriage, instead of presenting that ideal, they're talking about sexual rights, the rights to sexual pleasure at every age, the rights to have multiple sexual partners and not even inform them about your STD status. This is insane. I want to ask everyone in this room to take this information and act on it. We're going to be talking, after I finish in a minute, about a petition that's been drawn up. A petition against these programs that sexualize young children and promote an unhealthy lifestyle in the name of sexual rights, in the name of diversity, in the name of sexual freedom. We are facing catastrophic levels of sexually transmitted diseases all around the world. We're fighting a war against bugs, and the bugs are winning. In order to stem the tide and turn things around, we need a makeover of how we teach young people about sexuality. Please become a part of this movement, of the petition. Please tell people you know that couldn't be here today to also join in this. And I want you to all feel free to go to my website where I have lots of other information, miriamgrossmanmd.com. Please feel free to email me. That's my email. And thank you for listening.